Hi all. So, hope everyone's doing well today. Today we're going to wrap up what we started in chapter 10 and 11 and discussing how we view the macroeconomy and how we look at it. And in chapter 12, what we're specifically going to be doing is we're going to be looking at production and economic growth. And this really gets into questions of like, why are some countries wealthy and why are some questions not? And honestly, I think this is easily one of the most exciting discussions in economics. This gets us into a field called developmental economics. And there's a ton of great research in it because this subject is really about how do we improve the quality of living that individuals experience across the world. And so to get into it, let's just jump right into this. There's large differences in income, and those reflect large differences in the quality of life. I mean, that's fairly obvious. All of us can kind of look out and see on the news, just like celebrities, right? And their standard of living is radically different than our standard of living. But once you reach a certain threshold, what we find is richer typically means better nutrition, safer housing, better health care, and longer lifespans. This isn't universal either. It varies country to country, right? So certain countries are wealthier than other countries, and those countries have better resources and access to services than other countries. Growth rates vary substantially between country to country as well. Rich countries typically grow slower than poor countries, and we'll explain why when we talk about the catch-up effect. But there's some good news here because it means that poor countries are actually closing the gap, or should be closing the gap, between the wealthier developed countries and where they're currently at. Now, importance, Robert Lucas, a very famous economist, Nobel laureate, once made the comment that the consequences for human welfare in questions like these are simply staggering. Once one starts to think about them, it's hard to think about anything else. And the reason why is that economies' growth rates, when we consider what drives them, it gives us a concept of what policy should we pursue, and ultimately it gives us a concept of what worlds we can possibly achieve. So core is it is driven by a country's productivity, which in turn is influenced by a lot of things. And so two professors at MIT, Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, believe historical factors, geography, and institutions are fundamental in understanding how ultimately the development of countries. I have two video links here. You can find them in your study guides for this chapter. I highly, highly recommend you watch them. One of them is Acemoglu giving a review of his book with Robinson called Why Nations Fail. The other video is James Robinson's TED Talk on the situation in Greece and his explanation for why nations fail. So at the core of this, though, is productivity, right? We said productivity is the key factor in driving economic growth. And so why is it so important? Well, first off, what is productivity? Productivity is the quantity of goods and services produced from each unit of labor input, i.e., it is the quantity, how much we are able to from our own individual effort. So think of a simple example, a farmer. If a farmer's productive, he's able to eat more food and have a healthier food and balance and a healthier life. This seems not so important, right? Because you're like, well, if a farmer makes a ton and then he makes a ton more, well, there's only so much he can eat. But it makes way more sense when we think about it at the very low end. If he isn't productive at all, he goes hungry. So even a little bit of productivity over no productivity at all is a significant increase in his quality of living. How productivity is determined, though, is a bit more challenging. The first and most importantly is probably physical capital, and this is the stock of equipment and structures that are used to produce goods and services. So what matters here is that it's per capita. More capital per capita, more productivity. So just to give you an example of physical capital, your laptop that you're using to watch this right now, or your computer that you're using to watch this video right now, that is physical capital. Imagine if there was only one computer for everyone in our class. Imagine that I have to use one computer to make all my work and do all my assignments and create them for you. And then I have to give that assignment or that laptop to each student individually as we go throughout the course. That would be really inefficient, right? Even if we just had two laptops, that would dramatically improve our ability to get through the work. Even if we had three laptops, four laptops, five laptops, etc. And once everyone has a laptop in the course, then yeah, no, it's far more effective. So that's an idea of physical capital and per capita, the per capita ratio of physical capital is crucial to productivity. Next is human capital. This is the knowledge and skills that workers acquire through education, training, and experience. This first idea was articulated by a guy by the name of Gary Becker, who's also a Nobel laureate. This link here takes you to the article that really kind of explains his thought process on this. The key here is that human capital is the knowledge, not the consequence or the item made. So, for example, think of an ergonomic mouse. The mouse, right, is a mouse that basically contorts to your hand. It makes it more comfortable, easier to use, makes it flow better. The mouse itself is physical capital. The knowledge of ergonomics, the knowledge of how the hand works, and the knowledge of how to design a mouse that fits with the hand, that is a consequence of the human capital. That knowledge is itself human capital. Another example is your textbook. Your tech itself is physical capital, but the knowledge you learn from the textbook, that's human capital. Next, we have natural resources. Natural resources, these are inputs into the production of goods and services provided by nature, such as land, rivers, and mineral deposits. So, for example, Georgia has a lot of good agricultural farmland. They have timberland in eastern Georgia. These are things that affect Georgia's productivity as we pull from those resources. Texas also, meanwhile, has a lot of oil. So one of the things that helps drive Texas productivity is their access to oil and other natural gas reserves. Technical knowledge, this is society's understanding of the best ways to produce goods and services. A cool example here is that we know right about the manufacturing plant and like Ford creating the lawn manufacturing line. So the original Ford manufacturing line is this very long straight line. And so the way the United States conceived of making a long straight line is that, or conceived of the manufacturing line was they're like, just make it a long straight line, push things down in a straight line, and just add parts along the straight line. In an interesting connection between natural resources and technical knowledge, you couldn't make long straight line manufacturing lines in Japan. Japan is almost entirely mountains. It only has 15% of its landmass is flat. And so in order to have large manufacturing plants in Japan, you had to use the space effectively. And so what Japan did was instead of making long manufacturing lines, they ended up making a snaking manufacturing line. And so it winds back and forth through the plant. The benefit of the snaking line was that when something broke down on the line, you could just move the car off the line into the middle of the rows between the snake, and then employees could work and fix the car parts there, and Toyota could keep the cars moving along inside the plant. In the US model, however, the line had to stop and you had to work and fix the car there before moving it on. So that's an example of how Japan's understanding, based upon their natural resources, led to them to create a more efficient, productive production line. And so now today, a lot of American firms are introducing snaking manufacturing lines. So, what is the relationship, though, between these things and public policy and economic growth and public policy? Well, first off, saving and investment is a key component. Saving can basically be thought of as the sacrifice of present consumption for future consumption. So, when you save for retirement, right, what you're doing is you are putting aside money today so that you can access that money in the future and spend it in retirement. A higher savings rate equals a higher growth rate, typically, but this is a little tricky. Again, we can use an example in Japan. Japan actually has been in this sort of stagflation for the past 20 years, which means that they're not really growing, even though they have a super high savings rate. And there's a reason for that we'll revisit. Additionally, you have things such as the diminishing returns and the catch-up effect. What diminishing returns are is this is simply the property whereby the benefit from an extra unit of something declines as the quantity of the input increases. So I mentioned laptops in class, right? We can clearly see the benefits of how once we get to everyone has a laptop, we're more efficient as a class. But What happens if we add just one more laptop or two more laptops or three more laptops? While, like, yeah, it's cool because you can multitask now on two computers, the gain in productivity from just having additional laptops more than we have students in the class is much less than it was when we didn't have computers for everyone in the class to begin with. So, in the long run, growth caused by a higher savings rate tends to lead to a higher level of productivity, but it doesn't lead to a higher growth rate in these variables. And again, Japan is a classic example where they have a very high savings rate. It's about 10 to 12%. Even though they saved this much, their growth rate has slowed dramatically. Like, I think Japan posts like a marginal, if any, growth rate. So, because of this, though, the catch-up effect is the property whereby countries that start off poor tend to grow more rapidly than countries that start rich. So, because the additional impact of early inputs is greater than later inputs, that means that countries grow faster. So just an example, the Soviet Union's economy is the only economy during the Depression which grew. And part of the reason why is that the Soviet Union didn't have a lot of factories and industry. So even producing 15, 20, 25 factories is a huge growth as compared to the United States, which had thousands of factories but started closing down many of them. A direct comparison in the present is South Korea and the United States. South Korea has rapidly ascended in wealth since the end of the Korean War and is closing the gap with the United States. That's an example of a country which they're of the catch-up effect is they are closing the gap between their standard of living and wealth and the United States. So just to illustrate the catch-up effect in a graphical form, what you can see here is that this is basically the relationship is you have an axis where we have the output per worker, and then you also have an axis that is the capital per worker. And so what this is telling us is that as you increase the capital per worker, the output per worker still increases but slows down. That's why this curve starts off steep and then flattens out. So you can see how at low levels, increases in capital per worker leads to tremendous increases in productivity. So again, say we have a 20-person class, there's only 4 laptops in the class. Just adding a 5th laptop has like an exceptional increase in the productivity of the class. However, if we have 20 people in class and we have 20 laptops and we add one more laptop, well, the gain from adding one more laptop to a classroom of 20 people is less significant than adding a 5th laptop to a class of 20 people. For economic growth, continuing our discussion of public policy, investments from abroad play a huge factor in how much a country develops. So the United States has invested a lot in other countries, particularly Japan, South Korea, China. This is part of the reason these countries have grown tremendously. This concept is called foreign direct investment. And what this is this is a capital investment which is owned and operated by a foreign entity. So in South Carolina, BMW owns manufacturing plants for their SUVs. That's the example of foreign direct investment. That is a German company which owns a physical manufacturing plant in the United States. Another example is that Kia owns and operates a manufacturing plant, and Kia is South Korean. They own and operate a manufacturing plant in southern Georgia. There's also global institutions, the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. These are two financial institutions which serve to facilitate foreign direct investment. So, South Korea wants to build a factory in the United States, right? They have to buy land, they have to buy physical capital, they have to pay wage labor. What do they need to pay all those things? Right, they need dollars, but they're working in the United States. We're not going to take South Korea's currency because it's not useful for us. So countries can go to things like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, who provide the currency from other countries so that foreign firms can interact and invest in those countries. They also provide direct loans to foreign countries so those countries can develop themselves. Education is another huge component. Education can basically be understood as human capital development. So when we go to college, when we're taking these classes, you are learning skills and knowledge, which presumably will help you to be a more productive citizen, more productive worker and laborer in the future. However, just because countries provide ample education doesn't necessarily mean they're the beneficiaries. A big problem is brain drain. This is the moving of human capital from poor countries to rich countries. Particularly, there's a really weird example of how the Soviet Union used to be ultra specialized. And so, if you were found to be good at mathematics or have an aptitude for mathematics, what they would do is they would take you and they sent this everyone to this city in like the middle of Russia, and they just trained them to exclusively do mathematics and be exceptional mathematicians. When the Iron Curtain collapsed and when the Cold War ended, American firms immediately stepped in and said, "Hi, we'd like to hire you. We have a shortage of mathematicians. Would you like to come work in the United States?" And so a bunch of these Russian mathematicians moved to the United States and now work in the United States. And that's an example of brain drain. The human capital was developed in a different country, but it led to a direct transfer of knowledge to another country. Another example is foreign doctors. The United States has a shortage of doctors, and so other countries will educate doctors, but they then move to wealthier countries to get higher paying jobs where those countries have a shortage of these jobs. Health and nutrition. This is just a simple relationship. The wealthier a country is, the better it's able to take care of its citizens' health and feed them healthier. And these are public policy can encourage this, and this makes workers more productive. So just think, right, that like when you've had a healthy, well-balanced diet, you're more productive and able to focus on your work better than if you haven't. Or just think of the balance and the impact of a cup of coffee in the morning versus not having a cup of coffee in the morning. We also have property rights and political stability. This is one of the most direct ways or indirect ways that the government actually helps us. So property rights are simply the ability of people to exercise authority over the resources they own. Now, in this context, what we mean by property rights is basically imagine that the fact that you can own your car and you know that if someone stole your car, you could report it to the police and the police would try to get it back to you and would return it to you. That gives you confidence in owning your car. However, what happens if your car would be stolen and the government doesn't do anything? Or the government actually is facilitating you having your car stolen? It'd make sure you don't want to buy a car, right? It would make sure you don't want to own anything material because it could just as easily be stolen or taken from you. So countries that have strong property rights and protect individuals' private property are wealthier countries typically across the board because it encourages people to buy, spend, and invest. However, political stability also plays another role in this in the sense that nationalization is important. When a country assumes control over foreign owned assets such as manufacturing plants, this becomes a huge political issue for foreign direct investment. So, for example, several Latin American countries have nationalized foreign firms. And what that means is they step in, they take over and say, Venezuela now owns this manufacturing plant. So, Venezuela has been one of the big ones on this. And what that means is that if you're a foreign country and you're thinking of where do I want to put my money and develop, you could see a country that might be a great fit, but you're like, oh, well, if they're just going to take my factory from me, I don't want to be there. That's going to be a waste of money. And so, this is a aspect of the political stability within a country and how the government acts that either encourages or discourages foreign firms from interacting with them. Now, continuing on, let's get into the concept of free trade. So we mentioned trade in chapter 3, and we talked about how there's obviously benefits from trading. But countries have two sorts of options facing them. They can focus on inward-oriented policies, which is a focus on building domestic industry and blocking out foreign competition. The only countries that have typically pursued this, there's a few Latin American countries that have done it. There's a few Eastern European countries that have done it, a few African countries. Of them, Brazil's the only noticeably successful one, and Brazil has a lot of natural resource endowment. In contrast, outward-oriented policies are about integrating poorer countries into the world economy through free trade, and this is generally perceived as a preferable option. You get the benefits of specialization, a better flow of human capital and physical capital, and ultimately this allows for higher growth. So just an example, Argentina is the size of Houston. Its economy is the size of Houston, Texas. So to put it another way, Houston, Texas, a single city has the economy the size of a country of Argentina. Part of the reason for this is that Argentina chose to lock out foreign markets and tries to keep foreign markets at bay. And they actually have a lot of issues from this, particularly regarding trade, particularly regarding their ability to get finance and loans. However, there's also countries that count as outward-oriented countries are South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Germany, Taiwan. These are all quite wealthy countries and have tremendously grown. To be fair, though, this isn't a guarantee. Several countries in Africa have tried outward-oriented policies and haven't necessarily taken off yet. They've done better than their compatriots, but issues such as, again, political stability can have a significant impact. So just having one policy doesn't fix everything. It's important these things move together. And then research and development, just knowledge of a public good with positive spillover externalities. Just a fun example here. The original, if you've heard of Google Scholar, what Google Scholar is it is a research algorithm that allows academics to go find research papers and find academic authors and all the citations they have. So you can just type Google Scholar, type in a subject, and it'll just give you all the research on that subject. That's the original purpose of Google. But that's hardly how it's used today, right? Because the algorithm that Google operates under, that became a public good with positive spillovers. So the fact that Google operates in this way, this information transitioned to being used to search for anything and everything. And so that's a huge spillover externality that comes from a initial human capital research and development. Finally, we're going to conclude this section with just kind of revisiting the concept of population growth. It's a double-edged sword. And the reason why is that, first off, it dilutes capital stock. First off, the human capital, large populations like Bangladesh and India put immense strain on educational systems. And that means it's very difficult for very large population countries to afford the education system to educate and fully develop the human capital of their populations. Similarly, there's physical capital issues that occur. So just come back to our example of the laptops in class. Let's say that we have 20 laptops. If all of a sudden I increased our class size to 30 or 40, we get all the inefficiencies of having a out of whack ratio between our physical capital of laptops to students. Additionally, it stretches natural resources. This gets into a guy by the name of Thomas Malthus. He was like he's why economists sometimes are called the dismal scientists. And the reason why is because Malthus had this idea that the world's population was going to outgrow our ability to produce goods. And in the end, what this would mean is that people would starve, go hungry, and like society would collapse. He was wrong, and the reason why is because actually production growth and technology spurred and grew dramatically far beyond population. Although there are some concerns in countries like India and China right now. However, populations promote technological process. More people mean more ideas circulating. And in 1990, Michael Kremer, an economist, published a paper that confirmed that relationship. That while, yes, higher populations dilute capital stock and they dilute human capital and they stretch natural resources, they generate just as many ideas, and those ideas generated can be just as significant. And so for a final thought for you, if you find this interesting, and I hope you do because this is one of the most fascinating subjects, be sure to check out AC Moglu's note in your chapter. He has a very fascinating look at kind of the rise, fall of countries' economies. All right, we're going to stop here, and in our next section, we're going to get into financial markets. And so we're going to start getting into how does the actual economy and day-to-day function and work. Till then, take care.